Welcome back to Playgame HQ. I'm Daniel, and in this video we're going to teach you how to play Battleground Fantasy Warfare, published by Your Move Games, who helped sponsor this video. Battleground Fantasy Warfare is a miniature style wargame without the miniatures. Instead of miniatures, your units are represented by cards with everything you need to know about that unit printed right on the card. There are a ton of different sets available for this game, and for this video we're using the Men of Hawkshold set. The Men of Hawkshold set has enough cards for 2 players to play head to head, but players can also use different sets for some interesting matchups. In the box you'll find all of the cards, a quick start guide, and a full rulebook. What's not included that you will need to provide to play is a set of at least 6 to 12 d6 dice, a dry erase marker, and a ruler. We're going to go through the basic rules from the quick start guide in this video, and then once you're comfortable with those, you can dive into the more advanced rules from the full rulebook. First, let's take a look at the unit cards. Each card is 1 unit of troops on the battlefield. The back of each card shows the unit name and their point value, as well as any special instructions that go along with that unit. The front of the card shows the unit's artwork, and the exact center of each side of the card is marked with a red line. At the bottom is the stat bar, where you have your offensive and defensive stats, courage, and your movement range. The circle on the right is for that unit's standing orders, and the boxes at the bottom are to track damage. The cards are designed to be marked on with the dry erase marker, so everything you need to know during the game for that card, like standing orders and damage, are tracked directly on the card. Each deck also has command cards that can be used on your turn to modify or add to your standard actions or stats. Each card shows its name at the top and the description of its ability at the bottom, and the cards are color-coded for easy reference. Red cards are for attacking, blue cards are for defending, and green cards are played at other times during the game. But the instruction text at the bottom of the card also tells you exactly when that card is played. Now let's get into the actual gameplay. To set up the game, you need a flat play area, ideally around 36 inches wide by 30 inches deep. Because of the way the units move through the game, the size of your play area is also the size of your battlefield. So larger or smaller is fine, it'll just change how you might want to move your troops around during the game. You'll also need a few 6-sided dice. You'll typically roll up to 6 for attacking, so 12 will give each player their own set, and with 6 you'll have to share. Give each player a dry erase marker and then have a ruler handy to measure movement. If you don't have a ruler, it's technically optional because all of the movement for all of the different cards can be divided by different card lengths. And the reference card included in the game shows you how to calculate all of the different movement links using the cards included in the game. Shuffle the command cards and put them in a face-down deck, and then each player draws 1 command card. Because we're using a single box for this tutorial, both players in this scenario will draw from the same command deck. But if players are using separate sets for their armies, each player will have their own command deck to draw from. Next, you need to build your army. For this video, we're using the pre-built armies from the Quick Start Guide, and it's recommended that you do the same for your first game. When you're ready to build your own army, players will agree on a point budget. 1,500 to 2,500 points is a typical range, and then you'll build your army using the points on the back of the unit cards as their cost. So this Spearman card would be 220 points. The game typically ends when a player has defeated half of the other player's points. So in a 2,000 point game, the game ends when someone has defeated 1,000 points worth of units. So larger armies are obviously going to lead to a longer game, but will also open up a lot more strategic options. Once you have your units chosen, it's time to set them up on the battlefield. We're set up for the first scenario in the Quick Start Guide, which shows us exactly how to set up each unit. My table is larger than 36 by 30, so we're setting everything up off the back edge of this table. That means that the front of my first row of cards is exactly 7.5 inches from the edge of the table, and the 2 armies are exactly 15 inches apart from the front of each row. In a standard game where you aren't using a pre-built setup, each player has a deployment zone that's 26 inches wide, 7.5 inches deep, and the front edges of those 2 armies should be 15 inches apart. Within the deployment zone, you can set up your armies however you want, but no cards can ever overlap. Write a C in the standing order circle of all of your units, and now we're ready to get started. The game is played over a series of rounds until one player has enough points to take the victory. In this scenario, that's 425 points, and in a standard game, that again will be half of whatever your starting points budget was. And you score points by defeating enemy units, with each unit being worth the points on the back of their card. Each turn has 3 phases: movement and command, combat, and then the courage phase. In the movement and command phase, you'll move all of your units one at a time. Each unit has a standing order written in their standing order circle. Unless told otherwise, those units are going to follow that standing order automatically on your turn. There's 3 standing orders: close, range, and hold, represented by C, R, and H in the standing order circle on the unit. Each unit starts with the close command order at the beginning of the game, meaning that on your turn, those units are going to automatically move towards the nearest enemy that they can, and then attack them with a melee combat when they are next to that unit. If a unit has a ranged standing order, they'll attack the closest enemy they can using their ranged attack. And if they're not within range of any enemy, they'll move towards the nearest enemy unit during the movement phase until they're within range, but no closer than they need to be, and then they'll use their ranged attack during the combat phase. If a unit has a hold order, they stay where they are and they do not move. On your turn, you have a set number of command actions that you can use for a variety of different things, including overriding those standing orders on some of your units. In this scenario, each player has 2 command actions per turn, but in a standard game, you get 1 command action for every 500 points in your starting point budget. So in a 2,500 point game, you would get 5 command actions on your turn. You have 5 different options for your command action. You can change the standing order of one of your units by erasing it and writing a new one. You can take direct control of a unit and override its standing order. You can draw a command card from the command card deck. You can mark the bravery checkbox on your card, which will come into play later in the round. And you can rally a routing unit before it moves, which we'll also discuss later. Any actions you don't use are lost at the end of your turn. Now let's talk about movement. The simplest form of movement is going to be units with a close order. They are going to move their full movement distance, which is shown in their stat bar, towards the closest visible enemy unit. Each unit can see in a full 180-degree arc from the front edge of their card, so as long as part of an enemy unit is within that arc, it's visible. So these spearmen can see this scout cavalry here because it's within that 180-degree arc, but if it was here, it's no longer visible because it's outside of that arc. If multiple enemies are visible and it's not obvious which one is closer, measure from your unit's front center point to the center point on the enemy's nearest side to determine which one is closer. Once you know your closest enemy, move your unit their full movement distance in the fastest path possible towards that enemy. If you don't have a ruler, you can use unused cards to measure, and again, the back of the reference card has a breakdown of the measurements for each card side. So on our first turn, all of these cards are going to move in a straight line forward because the cards directly across from them are their closest enemy. My spearmen both have a movement of 3.5, which is the long side of a card. So I can use this card to measure the distance for that spearman. And then these 2 cards have the same movement distance, so I'll just move those up even with the front of that card. The Lancers have a movement of 6, so I'll use the ruler to measure that. And you'll move all of your unengaged units in whatever order you choose. In addition to moving in straight lines, you can also rotate a unit, still measuring the distance they move. If you have a newer game set, you may have had this wheel movement card included with your game, and you can use that or a ruler to measure your rotation. What we're going to show here is the basic rotation, and there are some advanced maneuvers you can use as well, and the details for those are found in the full rulebook. To rotate, use one finger to pin one front corner of your card and then pivot off of that corner and measure the movement distance of the opposite front corner. So if I'm rotating off of this corner, I would measure the distance moved on this corner. You can also use the wheel card by lining up the front edge and the pivoting corner with the corner of the red lines on the card, and then rotating to one of the pre-marked lines. So this would be a 3-inch movement. And you can combine multiple forms of movement as long as you don't go over your move distance. So these Lancers have a total movement of 6, so they can move 2 inches, do a rotation of 3 inches, and then complete their movement with 1 inch of additional forward movement. One important note is that no 2 cards can ever overlap at any point. So if I wanted to rotate this Spearman, I couldn't because I can't rotate it without overlapping this Swordsman card. So I would have to move forward out of the way and then rotate, or move this Swordsman out of the way to allow that Spearman to rotate. There's also going to be times when moving straight or turning isn't the fastest path, and that's where maneuvers come in. There's 4 maneuvers you can do on their own or in addition to other types of movement, but maneuvers cost movement points, meaning they're deducted from your total possible movement distance for the unit on that turn. Moving backwards costs 2 movement points in addition to the distance you're moving. So moving backwards 1 inch would cost 3 total movement points. Moving backwards also applies to turning. A standard turn movement can only be forward, but if you needed to turn backwards, you would apply the 2-point movement penalty plus however far you turned. You can also move sideways for a 1-point penalty, measuring your movement off the side of your card. So in our scenario where this Spearman wants to turn, but it can't because this Swordsman is here, I could move this Swordsman 2.5 inches to the side. That's 2.5 inches plus the 1-point penalty, and that's their total 3.5-inch movement. But then this Spearman is free to rotate without overlapping that Swordsman card. You can do an about face for a 1-point penalty, turning your card 180 degrees, and you can do a reform for 2 points, rotating your unit to face any direction. When you're moving a unit on a close order, you can use any combination of these movements to move towards that unit's closest enemy, but you should always do so in the most efficient way possible. If a unit with a close order ever starts their movement within the movement distance of the nearest enemy, they'll do what's called a final rush, meaning that since they're close enough, you don't need to measure, you just move them directly to that enemy, at which point they'll become engaged and will attack during the combat phase. So these Lancers have a movement of 6, and they're obviously less than 6 inches away from this Scout Cavalry, so they're going to go ahead and move directly up next to the Scout Cavalry in their final rush. The first step of a final rush is to determine the facing side of the enemy, meaning which side you're closest to. In this case, it was obvious because they were lined up, but it's not always going to be so obvious. To determine the facing side, draw an imaginary line diagonally across the enemy card through your card. The side of that line that the front center point of your card is on is the facing side. So in this case, because the front center of my spearman card is on the left side of that line, I'm actually closer to the side of the militia card than the front of the militia card. So the side of this card is the facing side. But if I'm over here, then I'm closer to the front of that card because the center of my card is on the right side of that line instead of the left side. If there's no other cards blocking your path, move the card next to the enemy card so that the center points are aligned. If another card is blocking you from fully aligning those two cards, you need to see if that side is open. It's open if you can line up at least half of your card with the card that you're closing on. So here, the front of that card is open because I'm able to align at least half of my spearman card with the militia card. But if this was the situation, this side is not open because I can't align at least half of my spearman card with that card. If that side is not open, you need to check the distance to the nearest open side, which would be the side of this card. If that side is still within range, then you'll final rush to that side. And if it's not within range, you won't final rush and you'll move like you normally would. So because this card is still within range, I will final rush to the side of that card. If you could final rush multiple units, always rush the closest, and if they're exactly the same distance, then it's your choice which one to final rush. There's no ranged units in the first scenario, so we're going to add in this bowman to show how ranged movement works. If a unit has a ranged standing order, they'll move up to their full movement, but stop once they're within range of the nearest enemy. So this bowman has a range of 14 inches, meaning they would not need to move on this turn to attack their nearest enemy, which is this militia. If they were 15 inches away from their nearest enemy, they would move 1 inch and then stop because they're now within range of that enemy and can attack them during the combat phase of that turn. And once you've moved all of your units, it's time to move on to combat. Now on your turn, only your units are going to move, but during the combat phase of your turn, all units for both players that can attack will attack, whether that's an engaged attack or a ranged attack. The active player resolves all of their possible combat first, followed by the non-active player, but regardless of who goes first, all combat is considered simultaneous. So even if I managed to defeat this militia on my turn, they would still attack me and do damage in return because on the actual battlefield, we're not taking turns. Before any attacks, check to see if a unit is pinched. A unit is pinched if it's engaged on 2 or more sides like this militia currently is. If one of those units final rushed this turn, the pinched unit rolls a rout check before any attacks are made, and we'll cover rout checks after we cover combat. To attack, pick a unit that is currently engaged. If a unit is engaged with multiple other units, choose which one you want to attack. We are going to talk about combat modifiers later in the video, and there are some things in this specific setup that would typically modify the combat stats for the attack and for the defense. But for this example, we're going to go through it as just a standard unmodified combat, and then we'll talk about combat modifiers later in the video. To attack, compare the attack stats and defense stats on the 2 cards involved. So we'll resolve an attack between this spearman and this militia. Your attack stats are the first 3 numbers in your stat bar. So for the spearman, that's 6, 5, and 5. The first number is the number of dice you roll, the second is your offensive skill, and the third is your power. The defensive stats are your second set of numbers, so for the militia that's 2 and 1. The first number is your defensive skill, and the second is your toughness. To resolve an attack, roll the number of dice shown in parentheses, so for the spearman that's 6. So I rolled 2 5s, 2 3s, and a 2. Next, compare the attacker's second number, which is their offensive skill, to the defender's first number, which is their defensive skill. Subtract the defensive skill from the offensive skill, and that's your target number. So in this case, that's 5 minus 2, so my target number is 3. Any dice equal to or lower than the target number hit. So in this case, all 3 of these hit because they are equal to or lower than 3, but these 5s do not hit. After you know how many dice hit, you're going to re-roll that number of dice to see how many of those dice land and cause a wound. To calculate your wound target number, do the same calculation with the last numbers in the offensive and defensive stats. That's the attack power and toughness. So the spearman's attack power is 5 and the militia's toughness is 1. So the target number to wound is 4. So I'm going to re-roll these, and anything equal to or lower than 4 will cause a wound. I rolled a 5, a 4, and a 3, so I have 2 dice equal to or lower than the target number, so I'm going to cause 2 wounds. Mark off 1 damage on the target card for each successful wound you cause, then repeat this process for each of your units in combat, then the other player will go through the same process to attack you back. During each attack, you have the option to play 1 command card from your hand to modify the attack, whether on offense or defense, following the rules on the bottom of the card. Once the attack is over, discard any command cards that you used. After all of the engaged units attack, all of your ranged units will attack, and a unit that's engaged can't make a ranged attack even if they have the ranged attack option. Ranged attacks resolve the same way as an engaged attack, and you can shoot over friendly cards to perform a ranged attack. So these bowmen can still attack this militia even though my spearmen are in the way. Once you make a ranged attack, mark off one of the ranged attack boxes on the side of that card. Once all of these are marked off, you can no longer use this unit to make ranged attacks. There's also combat modifiers that change your combat stats based on certain situations, like being pinched or flanking or attacking from the back. And you can find all of these modifiers in the quick start guide and all of the stat changes on your reference card. We're not going to go through all of the modifiers in this video, but one that I do want to explain because it would have technically applied to this combat, we just didn't do it because we were explaining basic combat, is that if a unit with a closed standing order becomes engaged on the front side of their card, on that turn, they're considered charging and they get to roll 2 extra dice. That's only on the first turn of combat that they're engaged with that same card. So if they're still engaged with that card on their next turn, they're no longer considered charging. And charging applies regardless of who closed on who. So in this case, on the turn that the spearmen closed on the militia, both of those units are considered charging and would both get a 2 dice bonus during their attack phase. If you're pinching another unit, meaning you have cards on 2 or more sides, then you get a bonus of +1 to your offensive skill and power. Attacking from the rear and flanking will also give you a bonus, while attacking from your side or back of your card will cause you a penalty. If you start an attack and your unit is in the yellow, meaning all of the green boxes are checked off, or in the red, meaning all of the green and yellow boxes are marked off, then you'll take a penalty to your combat stats. And if you're taking a ranged attack of more than 7 inches, or you moved the same turn you took a ranged attack with the unit, those both cause a 1-point penalty to your offensive skill. Once all units that are able to have attacked, combat is over. Remove any units who have all of their health boxes marked off, then move on to the courage phase. During the courage phase, units that took enough damage will roll a rout check. You'll roll a rout check if you marked off your last green or yellow damage box, or if you marked off any red damage box. If you meet more than one of those criteria, you still only roll 1 rout check. So in this case, the militia took 4 damage on this turn between these 2 units, and they would roll a rout check because they did mark off their last green box. When you roll a rout check, roll 3 dice and add the totals together. If the total of the 3 dice is less than your courage stat, which for the militia is 11, then you pass the rout check and nothing happens. But if the total exceeds your courage stat, then you fail the rout check. If you're in the yellow when you roll, meaning that all of your green boxes are checked off, then you reduce your courage stat by 1. So in this case, the militia's courage stat is actually 10. And if you're in the red, you would reduce your courage stat by 2. If that unit's bravery box is checked, which would have been done earlier in the game with a command action, that unit gets +3 to their bravery. If a unit with their bravery box ever fails a rout check or succeeds but would have failed without that +3 bonus, erase the check on their bravery box. If you succeeded on the rout check, nothing happens, but if you fail, you're going to turn tail and run away. So the militia did fail the rout check because 12 exceeds their current courage of 10, which is 11 minus the 1 for being in the yellow. When a unit fails a rout check, first erase that unit's standing order, then turn it so it's facing the opposite direction. Next, all engaged units get to take an extra free attack using the rear attack modifier, plus any other modifiers would apply. So both of these units are going to take a free attack on that militia. This could potentially cause another rout check, and if the unit fails that second rout check, it is immediately destroyed, even if it has health remaining. If the unit isn't destroyed, it immediately moves as if it were on close and the edge of the table were its target. It will continue to move this way on future turns unless you use a command order to rally that unit. Because the edge of the table is its target, if it's close enough, it will final rush the edge of the table, and if that ever happens, the unit is immediately destroyed. If a routing unit ever comes in contact with another friendly card, place the routing unit on the other side of that card, then stop its movement for that turn. And if a routing unit is ever final rushed by an enemy card, it's immediately destroyed. To stop a routing unit, you have to spend a command action to rally that unit during the movement phase. To do this, give the unit a hold standing order, then reform the unit to face any direction, and that unit can't move, attack, or have its standing order changed again on the same turn that it was rallied. Once the courage phase is over, it's the next player's turn, and play will continue until a player defeats enough units to get a winning amount of points. In the first scenario, that's 425 points, and in a standard game, the target number is half of the original points budget. And that's Battleground Fantasy Warfare. If you have any questions, be sure to leave us a comment below and we'll answer as quick as we can. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you later. Bye.